The phone rang just as Natalie was setting the dinner table, the clatter of silverware against porcelain echoing through the quiet house. She wiped her hands on a dish towel, glancing at the caller ID. Mom. Her heart gave a familiar, conflicted squeeze. It was that time of year again, Thanksgiving. A holiday that, in theory, should have been about warmth, togetherness, and love. But for Natalie, Thanksgiving had always come with an underlying tension, a quiet reminder that no matter what she did, she would always be second place. Still, she answered the call, ever hopeful that this year might be different. "Hey, Mom," she said, keeping her tone light. "Hi, sweetheart," her mother replied, her voice unusually cheerful. "I wanted to talk about Thanksgiving." Natalie instinctively braced herself. "Oh, what's the plan this year?" Her mother hesitated. Just for a second. A barely perceptible pause that made Natalie's stomach tighten. "Well," she began, "we just don't have space for your children this year." Natalie blinked, sure she had misheard. "What?" "We just don't have space," her mother repeated, breezily, as if she were discussing seating arrangements for a casual dinner party rather than telling her own daughter that her children were unwelcome at the family table. A strange, cold sensation spread through Natalie's chest. "But Oliver and Sophie have always been there for Thanksgiving." "What do you mean there's no space?" "Oh, honey, you know how small the house is," her mother said with a dismissive chuckle. "It's just easier this way." Natalie felt her grip on the phone tighten. "Is Claire coming?" Another pause. Longer this time. "Of course, Claire and her husband are coming. And the kids too." The words landed like a slap. A familiar sting, sharper this time, as if all the years of subtle favoritism had built up into this moment of blatant rejection. They weren't even trying to pretend anymore. Natalie swallowed the lump forming in her throat. "So let me get this straight. There's space for Claire's kids, but not mine." Her mother sighed, an exasperated sound that made Natalie's blood boil. "Sweetheart, you're overthinking this. It's just, well, you know we love those children more." The world seemed to tilt. The breath left Natalie's lungs in a rush. She had always known, in a way. She had seen it in the way her parents looked at Claire's children with unrestrained adoration, while Oliver and Sophie received only the bare minimum. She had felt it in the lopsided birthday gifts, in the forgotten school events, in the way her mother's eyes sparkled when she spoke about Claire's life but dimmed when Natalie tried to share hers. But knowing it and hearing it, stated so plainly, so unapologetically, were two very different things. "Are you serious?" Natalie's voice came out steady, though she felt anything but. "You're actually telling me, out loud, that you love Claire's kids more than mine?" Her mother sked. "Now don't be dramatic, Natalie. It's not a competition." No, it never had been. Because in a competition, at least she would have had a chance. This was something else entirely. A deep, crushing sadness settled into her bones, but beneath it, something else was stirring. Something stronger. Something that had been waiting for the... Natalie sat in silence, the phone still clutched in her trembling hand. The dial tone had long since faded, replaced by the quiet hum of the house around her, but she couldn't move. She couldn't think. Her mother's words still echoed in her head, reverberating like a cruel, endless refrain. "Well, you know we just love those children more." She had known it, of course. Some part of her had always known. But knowing something in the depths of your soul was very different from hearing it spoken aloud, without hesitation, without shame. A bitter laugh escaped her lips. Love wasn't supposed to be conditional. It wasn't supposed to be something weighed and measured, meted out based on preference, parceled out like an inheritance where some got riches and others only scraps. But that was exactly what had happened, wasn't it? She squeezed her eyes shut, pressing her fingertips to her temples as the memories came rushing back. Claire had always been the golden child, the perfect daughter, the one who could do no wrong. Their parents had praised her effortlessly, showered her with affection, cheered at her accomplishments as if they were their own. Even when she failed, they had been there, catching her, smoothing over her mistakes, giving her every tool to succeed. But Natalie? She had been expected to manage on her own. She thought back to the school talent show in 4th grade. She had practiced for weeks, learning to play the piano piece by heart, her little fingers dancing across the keys. She had been so proud of herself, so eager to see her parents in the crowd. But they hadn't come. Something had come up, something always came up. They had sent Claire instead, who had barely paid attention, too busy whispering with her friends in the audience. Later, when Natalie had asked why they hadn't been there, her mother had shrugged. "Sweetheart, Claire had her volleyball tournament the next day. We couldn't risk her staying out too late." Volleyball. A game. That had been more important than her. Natalie opened her eyes, the kitchen around her coming back into focus. The wooden chairs, the framed photos on the walls, the mess of toys scattered across the floor where Oliver and Sophie had been playing earlier. Her children. She thought of them now, not just as her kids, but as people. As people who had been disregarded by their own grandparents. People who, even as small as they were, had already begun to feel the difference. She remembered Oliver's last birthday. He had turned 8, and while he had been thrilled with the cake and the party she had planned, there had been a shadow behind his eyes when he opened his gifts. A sweater from his grandparents, hastily wrapped in a plastic bag. Claire's children, meanwhile, had gotten new bikes. Natalie had tried to shield them from it. She had told herself that they were too young to understand, that love was more than material things, that she could make up for whatever her parents failed to give. But she had seen the way Oliver's small hands had clenched into fists when he'd heard his cousins talk about their bikes, how Sophie had lowered her gaze when Claire's kids bragged about their special weekend trips to Grandma's house. She had told herself it wasn't a big deal. She had told herself it would get better. But it hadn't. And now it never would. She thought of the call again. Thought of the way her mother had dismissed her pain so easily, as if it were an inconvenience. Suit yourself. They had given up on her without a second thought. Without a fight. A wave of anger surged through her. They had never fought for her. Not when she was a child, begging for attention. Not when she was a teenager, working twice as hard to be noticed. Not when she became a mother herself, desperately hoping that things would be different. They had never fought for her. And she had spent her entire life fighting for them. She exhaled sharply, the weight of that realization nearly knocking the breath from her lungs. No more. She wouldn't beg for their love. She wouldn't chase their approval. She was done. The thought was terrifying and liberating all at once. She had always imagined cutting ties would feel like breaking, like tearing something fundamental inside herself. But now, in this moment, it felt like shedding something heavy. Something suffocating. The sound of small footsteps pulled her from her thoughts. Oliver stood in the doorway now, rubbing sleep from his eyes, his brown curls tousled from his nap. "Mom?" he mumbled sleepily. "Who were you talking to?" Natalie forced a soft smile, though she knew it didn't reach her eyes. "Just Grandma," she said. Oliver hesitated. "Are we going to their house for Thanksgiving?" Her breath hitched. She had a choice to make. She could lie. She could protect them from the truth a little longer, keep the illusion alive, keep pretending that their grandparents cared for them as much as they cared for their cousins. But hadn't that been the problem all along? Pretending? "No, sweetheart," she said gently. "We're staying home this year." Oliver's brows furrowed. "Why?" Natalie crouched down, brushing his curls from his forehead. "Because sometimes people don't treat us the way we deserve to be treated," she said carefully. "And when that happens, we don't have to keep going back for more." Oliver frowned, thinking. Then he nodded. "Okay," he said simply, before wrapping his arms around her. Natalie held him close, her throat tightening. This was what love was supposed to feel like. Not obligation. Not favoritism. Not a desperate scramble to be enough. Just this, a quiet, certain kind of love. One that didn't need to be earned. One that had always been there. As she held her son, she realized something else. For so many years, she had believed that her parents' love was the most important thing. That their approval was something she couldn't live without. But she had been wrong. This, her children, her home, the life she had built, this was enough. More than enough. She pulled back, kissing Oliver's forehead. How about we make our own Thanksgiving this year, she suggested. Just us. You, me, Sophie, and Dad. Oliver's face brightened. Can we make pancakes instead of turkey? Natalie laughed, warmth spreading through her. Absolutely. His grin widened before he ran off to tell Sophie. Natalie exhaled, her heart lighter than it had felt in years. For the first time, she wasn't longing for something she would never have. For the first time, she was free. Natalie woke up to the sharp ping of her phone vibrating against her nightstand. The room was still dark, save for the faint blue glow of the digital clock reading 6:42 a.m. Too early for a casual text. Her stomach twisted before she even reached for the phone, a gut instinct telling her exactly who it would be. She grabbed it and squinted at the screen. Claire. Natalie sighed, already exhausted. She debated ignoring it, but the bubble of dread growing in her chest wouldn't let her. With a deep breath, she unlocked her phone and opened the message. Claire, Mom said you're being difficult about Thanksgiving. Why do you always make things dramatic? Natalie stared at the words, her fingers tightening around the phone. Difficult. Dramatic. Of course, that was how they saw it. Not as a mother choosing to protect her children from blatant favoritism. Not as a woman who had finally drawn a boundary. Just difficult and dramatic. The problem was never what they did. It was always how Natalie reacted. She took a moment, breathing in deeply through her nose before typing a response. Natalie, did she also tell you she uninvited my kids but welcomed yours? She hit send and waited, her heart beating a little too fast. She could see the 3 little dots appear as Claire typed, disappear, then reappear. Finally, the reply came. Claire, you know how they are. Just let it go. Natalie let out a bitter laugh. You know how they are. That was the excuse for everything, wasn't it? Their mother's coldness, their father's indifference, the years of being overlooked and expected to just deal with it. Claire had long since learned to play along, to accept the unspoken rules of their family dynamic, rules that worked for her, not against her. But Natalie? She was done playing. Natalie, no. Not this time. Another pause. Then Claire responded with the same casual indifference their mother had mastered. Claire, fine. Do whatever you want. But don't turn this into some big thing. Natalie exhaled sharply, staring at the message, irritation prickling at her skin. Don't turn this into some. A week before Thanksgiving, Natalie was in the middle of folding laundry when her phone rang again. She hesitated before picking it up, her stomach twisting the way it always did when she saw Mom on the caller ID. After the last conversation, she had hoped for silence, for distance, for space to breathe. But no, that would have been too easy. She considered ignoring it, letting it go to voicemail like she had done the last few days. But something in her, a mix of curiosity and defiance, compelled her to answer. She pressed the phone to her ear. Hello? Her mother's voice came through, cheerful but forced, like someone trying to play nice before delivering bad news. Natalie, sweetheart. How have you been? Natalie narrowed her eyes, already wary. Fine. I haven't heard from you in a while, her mother continued, as if their last conversation hadn't ended in an unceremonious dismissal. I just wanted to check in. Natalie remained silent. She knew better than to fill the gap. Her mother thrived on control, on forcing others to make the first move. Sure enough, after a few seconds of awkward quiet, her mother sighed dramatically. Anyway, I actually needed to ask you something. And there it was. Natalie leaned against the counter, bracing herself. What is it? Well, her mother said, voice laced with fake sweetness, it seems there was a little issue with our credit card. Your father and I were out shopping yesterday, and it got declined. I'm sure it's just a mistake, but I was hoping you could check on that for us. Natalie froze. My credit card? Her mother let out a nervous laugh. Yes, dear. The one you put us on a few years ago. A sharp chill ran down Natalie's spine. She had almost forgotten about that. Years ago, when her parents had been going through a rough patch, financially, at least, that was the story they had told her. She had added them as authorized users on one of her credit cards. It had been meant as a temporary gesture, a safety net. And then life had gotten busy, and she had never thought to remove them. Now, her mind raced. How long have you been using it? Oh, sweetheart, you know how it is, her mother said with a dismissive chuckle. Just for little things here and there. A dinner out, some groceries, nothing major. Natalie felt her pulse quicken. If it's nothing major, then why did it get declined? A beat of silence. Then, her mother scoffed. Honestly, Natalie, I don't see why you're making such a big deal about this. Natalie inhaled slowly, gripping the edge of the counter. How much have you spent? Her mother sighed, as if she were the one being inconvenienced. I don't know off the top of my head. A few thousand, maybe. Natalie nearly dropped the phone. A few thousand? Oh, stop being so dramatic. You make good money. What's a little help for your parents? Natalie's hands trembled as she processed the words. What's a little help? They had never even asked. They had just taken. Mom, she said, her voice deadly calm, how long have you been using my card? Another pause. Then, in a tone so casual it made Natalie's blood boil, her mother said, Oh, I don't know. A few years? It's never been an issue before. Natalie's grip tightened. Because I didn't know. And what difference does that make? Her mother snapped. It's not like you were struggling. We're family. Family helps each other. A bitter laugh bubbled up before Natalie could stop it. Family helps each other. Wasn't that the exact opposite of how they had treated her? They had picked Claire time and time again, ignored her children, rejected them outright. And now they had the audacity to expect her to keep supporting them? No. No more. Natalie's voice came out cold and firm. I'm canceling the card. Her mother's tone immediately sharpened. Excuse me? I'm canceling it, Natalie repeated, every muscle in her body tensed with fury. Today. You can't do that, her mother snapped. Watch me. There was a stunned silence, and then her mother's voice turned icy. You'll regret this, Natalie. Natalie almost laughed. Regret what? Finally standing up for myself? No, Mom, she said, her voice steady. I think the only thing I regret is letting this go on for so long. You are being incredibly selfish, her mother hissed. We raised you. We gave you everything, and this is how you repay us. Everything? Everything? Natalie's vision blurred with fury. You gave me the bare minimum and called it love. Her mother scoffed. Oh, don't be ridiculous. I'm done, Natalie said, voice shaking, but not with fear. With finality. I'm done paying for people who don't even see my children as part of the family. You are making a huge mistake. No, Natalie said. I'm finally doing the right thing. She ended the call before her mother could say another word. Her hands trembled as she set the phone down, her whole body buzzing with adrenaline. It was done. She had finally said it. Before she could second-guess herself, she grabbed her laptop and pulled up her bank account. It didn't take long to find the card, to see the thousands of dollars that had been spent in her name, without her permission, without her knowledge. She canceled the card immediately. A weight lifted off her chest. For the first time in years, she wasn't tangled in the endless guilt, the suffocating obligation. She was free. A few minutes later, Marcus walked into the kitchen, rubbing his eyes. You're up early, he mumbled, then stopped when he saw her face. What happened? Natalie let out a breath, the whirlwind of emotions still settling. I just canceled my mom and dad's access to my credit card. Marcus's eyebrows shot up. Wait, what? Since when were they? Natalie had expected the fallout, but nothing could have prepared her for the sheer force of it. The call came barely an hour after she canceled the credit card. She had just sat down with Oliver and Sophie, helping them with their puzzle on the living room floor, when her phone rang again. The number flashed across the screen. Mom. She debated answering. Ignoring it would have been easier, but she knew her mother. If she didn't pick up now, the calls would keep coming. The texts, the voicemails filled with passive-aggressive barbs, the escalating guilt trips. Better to face it now and be done with it. With a deep breath, she stood, motioning for Oliver and Sophie to keep playing. She stepped into the kitchen, pressing the phone to her ear. Hello. Her mother's voice was a storm on the other end. You'll regret this, Natalie. Natalie flinched but held her ground. Good morning to you, too. Don't get smart with me, her mother snapped. What the hell do you think you're doing? Natalie exhaled slowly, keeping her tone even. I'm stopping you from using my money. You ungrateful little… Her mother cut herself off, taking a deep breath, clearly trying to rein in her temper. Natalie, listen to me. We are your parents. We raised you. We sacrificed for you. Is this how you repay us? There it was. The sacrifices. The unspoken debts she was always expected to repay, no matter how many years passed. Natalie's grip on the phone tightened. You keep saying you raised me, like that's some grand favor. That was your job, Mom. That's what parents are supposed to do. Her mother gasped. Excuse me? You didn't raise me out of generosity. You didn't feed and clothe me because you were some saint. You did it because I was your child. The way I do for my children. Oh, give me a break, her mother spat. You have no idea what we went through for you. I know exactly what you went through. I was there, remember? Natalie's voice hardened. I also remember the times you forgot my birthday but threw full-on parties for Claire. I remember my school plays that you missed, but somehow you were at every one of Claire's volleyball games. I remember how you ignored me when I was struggling because Claire's problems always seemed more urgent. Natalie, don't. No, you don't, Natalie interrupted, her own anger rising to meet her mother's. I have spent my entire life bending over backward for this family. I've forgiven things I shouldn't have, excused things I should have called out. But this? Taking my money without even telling me? And then having the audacity to call me ungrateful when I put a stop to it? No, Mom. I'm done. Silence. For a moment, Natalie thought maybe, her mother had finally run out of excuses. Then, in a low, seething voice, her mother said, You are making a huge mistake, Natalie. The threat in those words was unmistakable. But this time, they didn't scare her. She let out a soft, bitter laugh. No. The mistake was thinking you'd ever treat me as more than an afterthought. Another stretch of silence. Then her mother scoffed. Fine. If this is how you want it, then don't expect us to come crawling back. And don't think for a second that you can change your mind later. I won't, Natalie said simply. Her mother inhaled sharply, as if the finality of those words had taken her by surprise. Suit yourself, she said, and then click. The line went dead. Natalie stood there for a long moment, her heart pounding in her ears. That was it then. The bridge had been burned, the door slammed shut. She had known this moment was coming, but now that it had arrived, she felt nothing. No panic, no regret. Only a strange, quiet relief. She turned to find Marcus standing in the doorway, watching her carefully. So, he said, how did that go? Natalie let out a breath, setting her phone on the counter. As expected. She thinks I'll regret it. Marcus tilted his head. Will you? Natalie thought about it. Really thought about it. She searched for even the smallest sliver of doubt, some lingering fear that she had made the wrong choice. But there was nothing. No, she said. I won't. Marcus smiled softly. Good. She leaned against the counter, crossing her arms. It's just crazy to me. They rejected my kids, used my money, manipulated me my whole life, and still, they think I should be the one apologizing. Marcus shrugged. That's who they are. That's who they've always been. I know. Natalie ran a hand through her hair, exhaling slowly. And I'm finally done trying to change that. Marcus walked over, wrapping an arm around her shoulders, pressing a soft kiss to the top of her head. Proud of you. She sighed, leaning into him for just a moment before pulling back. Now comes the fun part. Marcus raised a brow. What fun part? The silence, she said, with a humorless chuckle. I guarantee they'll try to punish me by freezing me out. Marcus snorted. Good. You deserve the peace. Natalie thought about it. He was right. For the first time, there would be no tension-filled Thanksgiving dinner, no awkward, forced conversation, no pretending. Just her, Marcus, and the kids. Just peace. And she had earned it. That evening, she curled up on the couch with Oliver and Sophie, watching a movie while Marcus cooked dinner. The smell of roasting chicken filled the house, and for the first time in years, she felt truly light. Oliver rested his head on her shoulder. "Mom?" "Yeah, buddy," she murmured. "Are we still doing Thanksgiving?" Natalie smiled, pressing a kiss to the top of his head. "Of course we are. But not with Grandma and Grandpa?" Sophie asked hesitantly. Natalie hesitated, then said, "Not this year, sweetheart." Sophie was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Is it because they don't like us?" Natalie's heart squeezed painfully. She swallowed hard. "No, baby. It's because sometimes grown-ups don't make the best choices. And when that happens, it's okay to walk away." Oliver frowned. "Are they mad at you?" "Probably," Natalie admitted. Sophie looked up at her with wide, curious eyes. "Are you mad at them?" Natalie considered that. The anger had been there, of course. The betrayal, the resentment. But now, sitting here with her children warm against her, safe in a home filled with love, she realized something. She wasn't mad anymore. She was done. "No," she said finally. "I'm not mad. I just don't need them anymore." Oliver sat up straighter. "So, we're making our own Thanksgiving?" Natalie grinned. "Exactly." The kids cheered, and she laughed, feeling something inside her settle. This was how it was supposed to be. No more begging for love. No more bending to fit someone else's expectations. Just freedom. Just family. Just peace. And for the first time in her life, she had all three. 2 weeks passed in absolute silence. No texts. No calls. Not even a passive-aggressive email from her mother, which Natalie had half expected after their last conversation. She had braced herself for some grand gesture of guilt, an attempt to drag her back in, but instead nothing. At first, the quiet had been unsettling. After a lifetime of walking on eggshells around her family, she found herself constantly waiting for the next blow. But as the days stretched on, something unexpected happened. She relaxed. For the first time in years, she wasn't anxiously checking her phone, dreading the next manipulation disguised as concern. She wasn't spending her nights replaying old conversations, wondering what she could have done differently. She wasn't living under the weight of obligation, constantly trying to prove she was worthy of love that should have come freely. She was free. And she was happier than she had been in a long, long time. Thanksgiving had been perfect, pancakes instead of turkey, a day spent laughing with Marcus and the kids, watching movies in their pajamas, and making new traditions that didn't include forced smiles and buried resentment. The weight she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying had lifted, and with it came a clarity she had never known before. She didn't miss her parents. She didn't miss Claire. She didn't miss any of it. But then, just when she had convinced herself that they had finally let her go, the silence ended. The letter arrived on a Monday morning. It was waiting for her in the mailbox, a thick, official-looking envelope with her parents' return address in the corner. Natalie's stomach twisted the moment she saw it. She stood on the porch for a long moment, the crisp winter air biting at her skin, before finally tearing it open. Inside, neatly printed and stapled together, was a bill. An itemized bill. For her childhood. Natalie's breath caught as she skimmed the list, her eyes widening with each line. Food, $32,000. Clothing, $18,500. School expenses, $22,000. Housing, $7,500. Total, $80,000. At the bottom, in her mother's familiar, looping handwriting, was a note. "We have given you so much, Natalie. It's time you start repaying what you owe." Natalie let out a short, disbelieving laugh. They were charging her for existing. Her parents, the people who had belittled her, ignored her, used her, now wanted to be paid back for the bare minimum of raising her. The sheer audacity was almost impressive. Almost. Because beneath the absurdity, beneath the pettiness, there was something else. A final attempt at control. They had lost their grip on her, and they hated it. This wasn't about money. It was about power. And Natalie refused to give it to them. With slow, deliberate movements, she walked inside, set the letter on the kitchen counter, and poured herself a cup of coffee. She stared at the bill as she sipped, the anger she had once felt now replaced by something colder, something stronger. Amusement. They really thought this would bring her back? That this would make her crawl? They still didn't understand. She was done playing their game. By the time Marcus walked into the kitchen, she had already made her decision. He raised an eyebrow when he saw the papers. "What's that?" Natalie smirked, holding it up. "An invoice. For my childhood." Marcus blinked. "Wait, what?" "They're billing me. 80 grand. She let out a dry chuckle. Apparently, being their daughter wasn't free. Marcus took the letter from her, scanning it, his expression darkening with every line. "You have got to be kidding me." "Oh, I wish." "They actually think you'll pay this?" he asked, incredulous. "They don't care if I pay it. They just want to see if I'll react." She took another sip of coffee, the bitterness fitting for the moment. "They want me to feel guilty. They want me to fight with them, to try and prove I don't owe them anything. But I'm not playing." Marcus studied her, a slow grin spreading across his face. "So what are you going to do?" Natalie picked up the letter, turned, and ripped it cleanly in half. Then in half again. And again. She threw the pieces into the trash, wiped her hands off on her pajama pants, and took another sip of coffee. "That?" Marcus let out a low whistle, shaking his head with admiration. "Damn. That's kinda hot." Natalie laughed, shaking her head. "You married a badass, babe. Don't I know it?" She exhaled, rolling her shoulders. "I mean, come on. Can you imagine if I actually tried to take this seriously? Taking your own child to court for being born? What judge in their right mind would entertain this?" Marcus smirked. "Honestly, I'd love to see them try. They won't. They just want to scare me." She turned to face him fully, leaning against the counter. "And the funniest part? I'm not even mad." Marcus tilted his head. No, she shrugged. "Because this letter? It proves I won." Marcus nodded slowly. "Yeah, it does. They wanted me to keep begging, to keep needing them. But now? They have nothing left to hold over me. And they know it." Marcus grinned. "So what now?" Natalie took a deep breath, letting the weight of the moment settle. "Now," she said, "we move forward." She turned to look into the living room, where Oliver and Sophie were curled up under a blanket, giggling at their favorite cartoon. Her family, her home, her peace. For years, she had let her parents dictate her self-worth, let them decide when and if she was deserving of love. But not anymore. She had broken the cycle. And nothing, not a single manipulative letter, not a single empty threat, not even $80,000 in imaginary debt, was going to change that. The next morning, as she stood by the window sipping her coffee, her phone vibrated again. Another text from Claire. "Claire, I heard about the letter. Look, just apologize to them. It's not worth all this." Natalie smiled, a slow, satisfied kind of smile. She typed her response carefully. "Natalie, you're right. It's not worth it." Then she blocked Claire's number. With a deep, contented sigh, she turned back to her family, stepping into a future where she owed no one anything. And for the first time in her life, she felt truly, completely free. Natalie sat in her car outside her parents' house, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles ached. The crumpled remains of their ridiculous invoice sat in the passenger seat, but she wasn't here because of that. She was here because it was time. She had spent her whole life avoiding confrontation, swallowing her pain, telling herself it wasn't worth the fight. But this was different. This wasn't about trying to fix things anymore. It wasn't about begging them to see her, to love her, to treat her as an equal. This was about ending it. For good. She took a deep breath and stepped out of the car, the winter air biting against her skin. Every step up the familiar driveway felt heavier than the last, her past pressing down on her like a weight she was finally ready to shed. She rang the doorbell. No turning back now. A few moments later, the door swung open, and her mother's face appeared cool, composed, as if she hadn't just sent her daughter an invoice for existing. "Oh," her mother said, feigning surprise. I wasn't expecting you. Natalie forced a smile. That makes two of us. Her mother stepped aside. Well, don't just stand there. Come in. Natalie hesitated. One last time. Then, she stepped inside, the scent of cinnamon and lemon cleaner filling her nose. The house was exactly the same as always, yet it felt foreign now, like she no longer belonged. Maybe because she never had. Her father sat in his usual spot in the living room, reading the newspaper like nothing had happened. He barely looked up when she walked in. Of course. Natalie, he greeted, monotone. Dad. Her mother shut the door behind her with a soft click. So, she said smoothly, what brings you here? Natalie took a deep breath, pulling the crumpled invoice from her coat pocket and tossing it onto the coffee table. Her father's eyebrows lifted slightly. Oh, he said, setting the newspaper down. I take it you got our letter. Natalie crossed her arms. I did. Her mother sat gracefully in her chair, folding her hands in her lap. And? Natalie let out a humorless laugh. And? You seriously think I'm going to take this nonsense seriously? Her mother's lips pursed. It's not nonsense. We invested a lot in you, Natalie. We gave you a life, a home, an education. You act as if that didn't cost us anything. Natalie's jaw clenched. It was your job to raise me. Her father scoffed. You don't get to decide what we're owed. Oh, but you do, she shot back. You get to just slap a price tag on my childhood and demand payment decades later? Her mother sighed, the exasperation in her expression infuriating. We knew you'd react like this. Of course you did, Natalie snapped. Because I've been pushing back lately, haven't I? I've been saying no for the first time in my life. And you can't stand it. Her father leaned forward slightly. You think you're so strong now, don't you? Natalie met his gaze, unflinching. I know I am. His lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. And yet you still came here. Natalie's breath hitched. He was right. She had come. Because some small, stupid part of her had still wanted this moment to go differently. Had still hoped that if she looked them in the eye and showed them how deeply they had hurt her, they might finally feel something. But they didn't. And they never would. The realization hit her like a slap. Her mother sighed again, rubbing her temples. Natalie, let's not make this more difficult than it needs to be. Oh, trust me, Natalie said, her voice eerily calm now. It's not difficult at all. She reached into her bag, pulled out another paper, and set it on top of their ridiculous invoice. Her mother frowned, picking it up. What is this? She asked. Natalie smiled. An invoice. Her mother's eyes narrowed. For what? Natalie crossed her arms. For every dollar I covered with my credit card. Every dinner. Every trip. Every luxury you couldn't afford, but somehow had no issue charging to me. With interest. Her father's face darkened. Natalie. No, she cut in. You wanted to play this game? Fine. But it goes both ways. You want money? So do I. Her mother's lips pressed into a thin line as she skimmed the paper, her grip tightening. This is ridiculous. Oh, is it? Natalie tilted her head. Because I didn't sign up to financially support my parents. But you sure seemed fine with it when you thought I wouldn't notice. Her father slammed a hand against the armrest of his chair. This is enough, Natalie. No, she said simply. It's not. Her mother glared at her. You think you're punishing us? Natalie chuckled. I don't have to. You did that to yourselves. Silence stretched between them. Her mother was the first to break it, her voice dripping with venom. You think you can just walk away from this family? Natalie met her gaze, unwavering. I don't think. I know. Her father scoffed. And what will you tell your children? Natalie's chest tightened, but she refused to let them see the wound they had just tried to poke at. I'll tell them the truth, she said softly. That sometimes family isn't about blood. It's about who chooses you. And you never chose me. Her mother's eyes flashed. You're being dramatic. No, Natalie said, her voice firm. I'm being done. She turned, walking toward the door. Her heart pounded, but her steps were steady. As she reached for the handle, her mother called out one last time. "You'll regret this." Natalie turned, a slow smile spreading across her lips. "No," she said, her voice steady. "I won't." Then, without another word, she walked out. And this time, she didn't look back. On Christmas Eve, Natalie stood in her kitchen, humming softly as she stirred the rich, velvety hot chocolate in the saucepan. The house smelled of cinnamon and vanilla, the scent of freshly baked cookies mingling in the air. Oliver and Sophie sat cross-legged by the Christmas tree, giggling as they attempted to wrap their presents for Marcus with far too much tape and not nearly enough precision. For the first time in years, Christmas actually felt peaceful. There was no forced gathering, no tension thick in the air, no careful tiptoeing around Claire's endless bragging or her mother's passive-aggressive digs. There was just this laughter, warmth, love. She had done it. She had broken free. Just as she was about to pour the hot chocolate into mugs, the doorbell rang. Natalie froze, the sound sending a ripple of unease through her chest. No one was supposed to be coming over. Marcus was still up picking up a last-minute gift, and they had no other plans. Her stomach twisted. She already knew. She set the ladle down and wiped her hands on a kitchen towel before making her way to the front door. Through the frosted glass, she could see two silhouettes. She inhaled sharply. Her parents. She took a moment, steadying herself, before unlocking the door and pulling it open. There they were, standing on her doorstep, dressed in their usual polished way, her mother in a perfectly tailored coat, her father in a dark wool jacket. But their expressions were off. Smiling. Almost pleasant. Natalie's entire body tensed. "Merry Christmas, sweetheart," her mother said, holding out a brightly wrapped present. Natalie didn't take it. She folded her arms. "What are you doing here?" Her mother's smile didn't falter, though her eyes flickered with something colder. "We just wanted to drop off gifts for the children." Natalie didn't budge. "We both know that's not why you're here." Her father sighed. "Natalie, let's not ruin Christmas over a few disagreements." Natalie let out a sharp laugh. "A few disagreements? You sent me a bill for my childhood." Her mother waved a hand dismissively. "That's in the past." Natalie blinked. In the past? As if they hadn't just tried to manipulate and guilt-trip her mere weeks ago? She shook her head. "You don't get to show up here like nothing happened." Her mother's expression flickered with irritation before she quickly masked it. "Natalie, this is family. Families fight, families forgive." Natalie clenched her jaw. "Forgiveness requires an apology." Her father scoffed. "You expect us to apologize to you?" Natalie met his gaze, unflinching. "I expect you to at least acknowledge what you did." Her mother sighed, adjusting the scarf around her neck. "We're just trying to move forward. We miss the children." There it was. This wasn't about Christmas, about love, or even about making amends. They didn't miss her. They missed their access to her children. She had taken away their ability to pick and choose who mattered in the family, and now they were scrambling to reclaim it. Natalie exhaled, shaking her head. "No." Her mother blinked, clearly caught off guard. "What do you mean, no?" "I mean, no. You don't get to decide when to play grandparents. You don't get to ignore my kids when it's convenient and then show up with a present and expect everything to be fine." Her mother's lips pressed into a thin line. "Don't be selfish, Natalie." Natalie's laugh was bitter, sharp. "Selfish? You called my children less worthy of love than Claire's. You spent my money without a second thought. You tried to manipulate me into submission. And now you show up, expecting to pretend none of it happened? And I'm the selfish one." Her. A week after Christmas, Natalie was settling into the calm. The holidays had passed without a single argument, without any lingering resentment poisoning the air. Just laughter, warmth, and the quiet comfort of knowing she had made the right decision. Her parents hadn't called since she shut the door in their faces. Claire hadn't reached out either, not that Natalie had expected her to. There was nothing left to say. She had won. Or so she thought. Until the knock came. Natalie frowned as she walked to the door, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Marcus was at work, the kids were at a play date, and she wasn't expecting anyone. She opened the door and felt her stomach drop. Standing on her porch wasn't her parents. It was Jonathan, Claire's husband. His expression was unreadable, hands tucked into the pockets of his coat. The winter wind ruffled his hair, but he didn't shiver. He just stood there, waiting. Natalie crossed her arms. "You've got to be kidding me." Jonathan sighed. "Can I come in?" "No." He exhaled through his nose, nodding slightly. "All right. Then I'll just get to the point." Natalie tilted her head, waiting. Jonathan's next words sent a bolt of ice down her spine. "They're looking into grandparents' rights." Natalie felt the air shift. Everything in her body stilled. She stared at him, barely breathing. "Come again?" Jonathan shifted slightly. "Your parents. They've been talking to a lawyer. They think they might be able to force visitation rights with Oliver and Sophie." Natalie's fingers curled into fists. "They wouldn't." "They would." Her pulse pounded in her ears. "This is insane." Jonathan sighed. "I told Claire it wouldn't work, but you know how they are. They think they can control everything." Natalie let out a short, humorless laugh. "They don't even like my kids." "They don't care," Jonathan said simply. "This isn't about them wanting to be grandparents, Natalie. This is about winning." Natalie's stomach twisted violently. She had expected pettiness. She had expected guilt trips, more manipulation, maybe even a smear campaign within the extended family. But this? This was a new level of disgusting. They were actually trying to use the legal system to claw their way back into her life. Her parents, the same people who had told her, to her face, that they loved Claire's kids more, were now threatening to force their way into Oliver and Sophie's lives against her will. Natalie exhaled sharply, forcing herself to focus. "They don't have a case." Jonathan shrugged. "Probably not." "Probably?" He rubbed a hand over his jaw. "Grandparents' rights vary by state. If they can prove they had an established relationship with the kids and that being cut off is somehow harming them, they might be able to argue for visitation." Natalie shook her head. "They don't even know my kids' favorite colors, Jonathan. They forgot Oliver's last birthday." "Yeah," Jonathan said. "But if they find the right judge? The right lawyer? They'll spin whatever story they need to." Natalie hated how true that sounded. She knew her parents. They wouldn't fight fair. They would lie, manipulate, twist every truth until it was unrecognizable. They'd paint her as unstable, as dramatic, as an emotional wreck keeping their beloved grandchildren from them out of spite. They would do anything to win. Natalie took a slow, steadying breath. No. They weren't going to take her children. They weren't going to get away with this. She straightened, her voice turning cold. "They want to take me to court? Fine. Let them try." Jonathan gave her a long look. "You sure?" Natalie's lips curled into a slow, razor-sharp smile. "They have no idea what they've just started." Jonathan smirked slightly. "That's what I told Claire." Natalie raised an eyebrow. "Why are you even telling me this?" Jonathan hesitated. "Because," he admitted, "I think they're out of their minds. And I figured you'd want a heads up." Natalie studied him. Jonathan had always been different. Unlike Claire, he wasn't blind to their family's flaws. He had a habit of sitting back, watching, listening, never fully engaging in the chaos. He had never intervened before. But this was different. Natalie nodded slowly. "Thanks for the warning." Jonathan exhaled, nodding back. "Good luck." And with that, months passed. The legal threats had come and gone, just as Natalie had predicted. Her parents had hired a lawyer, sent letters, and attempted to build a case. They had painted themselves as devoted grandparents, unfairly denied access to their beloved grandchildren. They had tried to twist the truth, rewriting history in their favor, turning every moment of neglect into a misunderstanding, every cruel comment into a joke, every manipulation into a misinterpretation. But Natalie had been ready. She had gathered everything, every receipt, every voicemail, every dismissive text message, every bank statement proving they had used her credit card without her consent. She had shown the court exactly who they were. And in the end, her parents had lost. No visitation. No rights. Just silence. Absolute final silence. Now, sitting on the porch with a cup of tea, Natalie breathed in the crisp spring air, letting it fill her lungs with something she hadn't felt in years. Peace. Marcus stepped outside, handing her a fresh cup of tea. He sat beside her, stretching his legs out with a content sigh. "It's really over," he murmured, watching the sunset. Natalie nodded, sipping her tea. "It is. No more phone calls. No more guilt trips. No more manipulation disguised as family concern." For the first time, they couldn't touch her. Marcus studied her carefully. "How do you feel?" Natalie thought about it. She had spent months preparing for battle, arming herself with evidence, reliving painful memories just to prove what should have been obvious. It had been exhausting, infuriating, draining. But now? Now, she felt light. "I feel free," she admitted. Marcus smiled, reaching over to take her hand. "Good." The screen door creaked open, and Oliver and Sophie tumbled out onto the porch, giggling as they chased each other around the wooden steps. Natalie watched them, warmth spreading through her chest. This was what mattered. Not the family she had been born into. Not the approval she had spent years chasing. This, her real family. Her home. Oliver plopped onto the porch swing beside her, his curls tousled from running. "Mom?" "Yeah, buddy. Are Grandma and Grandpa ever coming back?" The question was innocent, but it still hit like a stone in her chest. She met his gaze, considering her words. For so long, she had hidden the truth, softened it, made excuses, tried to shield him from the reality of who they were. But he was old enough now. Old enough to know. "No," she said gently. "They're not." Oliver frowned slightly. "Why not?" Natalie reached out, brushing a stray curl from his forehead. "Because, sweetheart, sometimes people don't treat us the way we deserve to be treated. And when that happens, we don't have to let them stay in our lives." Oliver was quiet for a moment, thinking. "Like how you always say we should only play with kids who are nice to us?" Natalie smiled softly. "Exactly like that." Oliver nodded, as if that made perfect sense. Then, satisfied, he hopped off the porch swing and ran after Sophie. Natalie exhaled, watching them go. For so long, she had feared that cutting off her parents would somehow damage her children, that they would feel the loss of not having grandparents in their lives. But now, watching them laugh and play, she realized something. They weren't missing anything. They had love. They had stability. They had everything they needed. She had spent her whole life waiting to be chosen. But she didn't need to be chosen anymore. She had chosen herself. And that was enough. Marcus squeezed her hand. "Think they'll ever try again?" Natalie watched the sun dip below the horizon, the sky painted in soft shades of pink and gold. She took a slow sip of her tea, letting the warmth settle in her chest. "Doesn't matter," she murmured. Because it was too late. She had already won.